There is something about the word last that carries its own particular weight when it appears before the word port. Not the most recent port, not the nearest port, but the last one. The final place where a ship can take on water and food and rope and men and all the thousand small necessities that keep a vessel alive before the open ocean swallows everything behind it, and there is nothing ahead but distance and uncertainty and the slow arithmetic of survival. The last port is not simply a location on a chart. It is a threshold. It is the edge of the supported world. Welcome. If you are listening to this tonight in the quiet of your home, or lying in bed with the lights off and the rest of the world faded away, then you have chosen a good story to carry you through the dark. This is a sleep story, and it is also a history, a long unhurried journey through some of the most extraordinary moments in the human relationship with the sea, with distance, with hunger, and with the particular kind of courage it takes to sail past the last known thing and keep going. Tonight we're going to travel across several thousand years of human history. We're going to sit with navigators who did not know the shape of the world they were crossing, with admirals who watched their fleets dissolve for want of fresh water, with soldiers who chewed leather belts because the supply wagons had stopped coming 3 weeks ago, with Antarctic explorers who lay in tents 11 miles from the depot that might have saved them. We're going to look at the mathematics of survival at sea and on land, the calculations that sailors and soldiers and explorers made in the absence of certainty, the guesses dressed up as navigation, the prayers dressed up as provisioning plans. We will begin in the ancient Mediterranean, where the Carthaginian explorer Hanno sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules with 60 ships and perhaps 30,000 people and discovered a continent. Then we will move through the Persian Wars and the logistics nightmare behind Xerxes' invasion of Greece. We will sail with Zheng He's treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean, and with Vasco da Gama as his crew fell apart from scurvy off the coast of Africa. We will go north to the frozen shores of Hudson Bay with Henry Hudson, and south with Scott and Shackleton to the ice shelf at the bottom of the world. Along the way, we will pause on stories that don't always get told. The quartermaster who saved a fleet by making a decision that never appeared in the history books. The island that became the pivot of an empire because it had fresh water when everything else was salt. The supply cache that was missed by 12 hours and what that 12 hours cost. We will talk about the first steam warships and the coal that made them prisoners of geography, about U-boats and the near starvation of Britain, about Japanese garrisons on Pacific Islands who ate grass and boiled leather from their boots while waiting for supply ships that never came. This is a story about the edge, about what happens when human beings push past the places where anyone has thought to leave a supply of food and water and hope. And it is, in the end, a story about how extraordinarily often they made it through, and the handful of times, quiet and irreversible, that they did not. Find a comfortable position. Let the history begin. To understand what it meant to miss a supply port, you first have to understand what a supply port was. In the ancient world, this was not a romantic concept. It was a matter of pure mechanical survival, and the people who thought about it most carefully were not admirals or emperors, but the men who tallied barrels. The ancient Mediterranean was, in many ways, the ideal sea for early civilization. It is large enough to be vast, small enough to be navigable. It is mostly enclosed, which means that the winds, while unpredictable, are at least seasonally consistent. It is dotted with islands. The Aegean alone contains somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000 islands, depending on how generously you draw the coastline, which meant that a captain in distress was rarely more than a day or two sailing from shelter. The Mediterranean was, in the vocabulary of ancient navigation, a forgiving sea, and because it was forgiving, it taught sailors habits of mind that became dangerous when they tried to apply them to oceans that were less generous. A trireme, the dominant warship of the ancient Greek world, was an extraordinarily demanding vessel. It was propelled by between 170 and 200 men, 3 banks of oarsmen stacked in a configuration so tight that each man had perhaps 18 inches of lateral space. The ship moved fast, very fast by ancient standards, capable of perhaps 7 or 8 knots at sprint pace, but it consumed water at a rate that seems almost impossible until you do the arithmetic. A man rowing hard in the Mediterranean summer sun needs perhaps 2 litres of water per hour. Multiply that by 170 men rowing for 6 hours, and you have the equivalent of filling a small swimming pool. A trireme carried water in amphora, those tall two-handled ceramic jars that are so characteristic of the ancient world, but not enough for more than a few days of serious operational sailing. The trireme, for all its elegant engineering, was a coastline ship. It needed to put into port every night if possible, and certainly every 2 or 3 days. The port was not optional. The port was the difference between a fighting fleet and a collection of dying men drifting in the current. The grain-carrying cargo ships of the same period were different in their silhouette, and different in their needs, but not fundamentally different in their vulnerability. They were fat, round-bellied vessels, the round ships of the ancient world, called strombi in some texts and onerea in Latin, and they relied primarily on sail rather than oar. They were slower and harder to manoeuvre, but they could carry vastly more cargo. The largest of them, in the Roman imperial period, could carry perhaps 1,000 tons of grain. A ship that size needed a crew of perhaps 20 or 30 men, and those men needed far less water per day than a trireme crew. But the ship itself needed something that no amount of planning could guarantee: wind. Ancient sailing was overwhelmingly dependent on the seasonal winds, and the sailing season in the Mediterranean ran roughly from late March to early November, with May through September being the safest and most predictable window. Outside that window, the sea became progressively more dangerous. Winter storms in the Mediterranean are not the same as Atlantic gales, but they are more than capable of sinking a wooden ship, and the combination of reduced visibility, unpredictable wind, and the absence of stars for navigation made winter sailing genuinely hazardous. The Romans had a phrase for the dangerous transitional seasons: mare closum, the closed sea. When the sea was closed, you waited. And when you waited, you needed to be somewhere with food and shelter. The supply chain of ancient maritime civilization was built around this reality. Every major port and dozens of minor ones existed partly as a place of commercial exchange, and partly as a place where a ship could reload its basic necessities. The biscuits, hard, twice-baked grain bread that could survive weeks without serious decay, the dried fish, the oil, the wine mixed with water, the stored fresh water in sealed amphorae, the salt, the rope, the caulking pitch, the spare timber for emergency repairs. A port was not merely a market, it was a machine for keeping ships alive, and the men who managed that machine were among the most important people in the ancient world. Though history has largely forgotten their names, the Phoenicians, who were, perhaps the greatest maritime civilizers of the ancient world, understood this better than anyone. Their cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and later Carthage, were not beautiful accidents of geography. They were chosen with the eye of men who thought about the next problem before the current one was solved. Tyre sat on a small island off the coast of what is now Lebanon, positioned to catch the winds that came down from the north in summer and the southern breezes of winter. It had good anchorage, defensible position, proximity to the cedar forests of Lebanon, which provided the finest shipbuilding timber in the ancient Mediterranean world. Sidon, to the north, controlled access to the trade routes that went inland toward the great cities of Mesopotamia. Byblos was even older, a city that had been trading with Egypt for perhaps 2,000 years before Alexander's armies arrived. But it was Carthage, built on a peninsula in what is now northern Tunisia, looking out across the sea, towards Sicily, that became the master of the supply port concept. Carthage did not merely use supply ports, it built a system. It positioned colonies and trading posts at strategic intervals along the coast of North Africa, on the islands of the western Mediterranean in southern Iberia, and eventually, according to some accounts, along the Atlantic coast of what is now Morocco and Mauritania. These were not grand cities. Many of them were small outposts, little more than a sheltered anchorage, a warehouse, a water source, and a garrison of soldiers to keep order. But together, they formed something that no other civilization of the ancient world had quite managed to create, a supply network that stretched across the known western Mediterranean and then, remarkably, beyond it. The Carthaginian coinage of the era reflects this commercial precision. Archaeologists have found Carthaginian artifacts along coasts where no Carthaginian army ever marched, in places that historians once thought were beyond the Carthaginian world. These artifacts, weights, pottery shards, amphorae handles, are the material traces of the supply network, the physical evidence that the Carthaginians were more widely travelled than their own records explicitly state. They were building an infrastructure of supply, stone by stone and warehouse by warehouse, along routes that only they fully understood. It is in the context of this network that the story of Hanno the Navigator becomes extraordinary. Hanno was a Carthaginian admiral, probably of the 5th century BC, though the exact date is debated among ancient historians. He led what was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious maritime expeditions of the ancient world, a voyage down the Atlantic coast of Africa, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, into territory that no Carthaginian, and possibly no Mediterranean sailor, had ever visited. We know about this expedition because a Greek text survives, the Periplus of Hanno, a brief account of the voyage that may be a translation of an original inscription that Hanno set up in the Temple of Baal at Carthage. The text is short, only 18 paragraphs, but it contains details that have been argued over by scholars for centuries. According to the Periplus, Hanno set out with 60 pentaconters, 50 oared ships, and 30,000 men and women, with the apparent purpose of establishing Carthaginian colonies along the African coast. The number 30,000 is almost certainly an exaggeration, or a mistranslation, or a conflation of the total population of all the colonies established rather than the people on the ship simultaneously. 60 pentaconters could carry perhaps 3,000 people at most, and that would be an extremely uncomfortable 3,000, sleeping in shifts on bare wood decks with provisions piled around them. But the scale of the expedition was clearly significant, and its purpose was not purely exploratory. Hanno was building a supply chain. He was extending the Carthaginian network beyond the edge of the known world, planting outposts that would provision future voyages into territory no one had yet named. The early part of the voyage follows a geography we can recognise. Hanno sailed through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and turned south. He established a colony at a place he called Thymiaterion, probably near the site of the modern Kenitra in Morocco, on the Atlantic coast. He founded another at a place near Cape Spartel, the northwestern tip of Africa. Then he turned the cape and sailed south along the Moroccan coast, stopping to establish more colonies at sites with good water and anchorage, sending shore parties ahead to test the conditions, managing his fleet with the careful discipline of a commander who understood that the margin for error was small. This is the supply port logic made visible. You do not sail past the last known source of fresh water until you have found the next one. You inch forward, each advance secured by a new foothold, each new foothold becoming the foundation for the next advance. It is an incremental logic, patient and methodical, and it looks nothing like the heroic narratives of exploration that later centuries would construct. It looks, if anything, like good project management, which is perhaps why it has received less attention. But at some point, the text is frustratingly vague about exactly when. Hanno stopped establishing colonies and began simply exploring. He sailed south past the great river that most scholars identify as the Senegal, where he encountered hippopotamuses and crocodiles and indigenous people who lit fires along the shore at night, creating spectacles that his sailors of the enclosed Mediterranean would never have seen before. He sailed further south, and the account becomes more vivid and more strange with each paragraph. He describes a great bay, and beyond it a large island, with a lagoon. He describes mountains that burned at night, almost certainly a reference to Mount Cameroon, the great active volcano of the West African coast, whose summit shows fire after dark. He describes encountering gorillas, calling them wild, hairy women, almost certainly the first Near Eastern or European text to describe great apes, and capturing 3 of them for his fleet, though his sailors apparently killed them when they proved too fierce to transport alive. And then, finally he turns back. The ships, the text tells us simply, were running short of provisions. This is the moment. This is the last port problem in its most fundamental form. Hanno had sailed far enough that the Carthaginian supply network no longer reached him. There were no warehouses here, no stored biscuits, no sealed amphorae of water from the springs of Carthage. There was only what the ships had carried from the last colony, and what they could find along the shore, and those resources were dwindling. The decision to turn back was not a decision of courage or cowardice, it was a decision of arithmetic. When the food runs out, you cannot sail. When you cannot sail, you die. Hanno turned his fleet around, pointed north toward the Pillars of Hercules, and the far coast of Africa would remain unknown to Mediterranean civilization for another 2,000 years. What is remarkable is not that Hanno turned back. What is remarkable is how far he had gotten. His voyage represents one of the longest maritime expeditions recorded from the ancient world. A journey of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 miles from Carthage, along a coastline that had no supply infrastructure of any kind beyond what his ships could carry and what his colonists had built. The fact that he returned at all is a testament to the discipline of Carthaginian naval logistics, to the careful management of water and food that allowed his fleet to push so far and still have enough to get home. The lesson of Hanno's voyage is not that the last port is terrifying, it is that the last port is a calculation. You push as far as the provisions allow, then you stop, and then, if you have calculated correctly, you make it back. The civilizations that followed would not always calculate so carefully, and the consequences would be correspondingly more dramatic. The ancient world ran on grain. This is not a metaphor. The populations of the great Mediterranean cities, Rome, Alexandria, Carthage, Antioch, Constantinople, were too large to be fed by their immediate hinterlands. Rome in the imperial period had perhaps 1 million inhabitants, maybe more, crammed into a city of tenements and palaces and temples and public baths and theatres that sprawled across the 7 hills and the flat floodplain of the Tiber. The surrounding countryside, the fertile Latium that had fed the early city, could supply perhaps 1/10 of what 1 million people needed. The rest had to come by ship. The grain came primarily from Egypt, the greatest grain-producing region of the ancient Mediterranean, where the annual flooding of the Nile deposited a fresh layer of silt across the delta and the valley each year, renewing the soil in a way that rain-fed agriculture could not match. It also came from the farms of North Africa, from the broad plain of the Tell that lies between the Atlas Mountains and the sea, from the rich valleys of what is now Tunisia and Libya. And it came from Sicily, the large triangular island at the centre of the Mediterranean that the Romans sometimes called the granary of the empire, and which had been producing grain for export since the earliest days of Greek colonization. The grain fleets that made this system work were enormous by ancient standards. In a good year, Egypt exported perhaps 135,000 tons of grain to Rome, enough to fill roughly 750 of the largest grain ships of the period, making the round trip once a year. These were specifically designed ships, deep-drafted and round-bellied, built for cargo capacity rather than speed, and they depended entirely on the seasonal winds of the Mediterranean for their movement. A dead calm was, for a grain ship, a serious problem, a headwind was worse, and a Mediterranean winter storm was potentially fatal. In 22 BC, something went wrong with the supply chain. The sources are fragmentary. The historian Dio Cassius mentions the crisis, and there are scattered references in other texts. But the outline is clear enough. The grain fleet from Alexandria was delayed, arriving in Rome significantly later than expected, and the grain reserves in the city ran dangerously low. The bakeries reduced their output. The price of bread, which was heavily subsidized or simply provided free to a large portion of Rome's population through the annuna system, became uncertain and then briefly unavailable. The crowd began to murmur, and then the crowd began to shout, and then the crowd began to riot. The riots of 22 BC are a small footnote in the reign of Augustus, sandwiched between more dramatic political events like the constitutional settlement and the Eastern campaigns. But they illuminate something important about the ancient world's relationship with supply chain fragility. It was not just that individual ships ran out of provisions at sea, it was that entire cities ran out of provisions on land, because the supply chains connecting them to their food sources were long and fragile and dependent on variables that were not fully within human control. The harvest, the winds, the efficiency of the harbour administrators at Alexandria, the capacity of the unloading facilities at Ostia, the condition of the roads between the river port and the city's grain warehouses. Augustus responded by assuming personal control of Rome's grain supply, creating the office of Praefectus Annonae, the grain prefect, and rebuilding the management system from the ground up. He reorganized the shipping contracts, expanded the warehouses called Horea that stored the grain in the city, and built the new port of Portius near Ostia to supplement the existing river port facilities. The Claudian harbour at Portus, completed under his successor, was one of the great engineering projects of the early imperial period. An artificial harbour enclosed by massive breakwaters, capable of accommodating the largest grain ships and protecting them from the storms that could batter an open anchorage. It was infrastructure built specifically to address the supply port problem, to ensure that the food coming by sea could reliably make it to the last port. But the underlying fragility remained. The grain still had to cross the sea still had seasons. And occasionally, as Rome would discover again and again over the centuries that followed, the sea did not cooperate. The records of the Annona, the grain dole and supply system, are full of moments when the supply was threatened. A bad harvest in Egypt, a storm season that delayed the fleet, a rebellion that disrupted the North African farms. Each of these moments was a version of the last port problem, dressed in the bureaucratic language of imperial administration. A Roman warship on active campaign was expected to carry perhaps 15 to 20 days of provisions. This was calculated on the assumption of reasonably favourable sailing conditions, reasonably efficient provisioning at each port, and reasonably good luck with the weather. When any of these assumptions failed, and they failed with some regularity, the ship's situation became difficult in ways that escalated quickly. The standard Roman military ration was a combination of grain, usually in the form of hardtack, the twice-baked bread that resisted spoilage, salt, olive oil, and occasional dried meat or saltfish. It was monotonous. It was nutritionally adequate in the short term for men doing ordinary work, but for men rowing and sailing in summer heat, or fighting or marching in the field, ordinary rations were barely sufficient and short rations were rapidly debilitating. The Roman writer Xerxes, writing in the 4th century AD about military logistics, has a remarkable passage about the relationship between supply and military effectiveness. He argues, with clarity that goes well beyond the conventional glorification of military virtue, that an army that runs out of food loses not merely its fighting capacity, but its cohesion, its ability to function as a unit at all. Hunger, he observes, does things to men that even fear cannot do. It dissolves the bonds of discipline that military training builds, because the drive to eat is more fundamental than the drive to obey orders, and when the two come into conflict, hunger usually wins. This was not a theoretical observation. Vegetius was drawing on centuries of Roman military experience, on the accumulated knowledge of an institution that had failed in exactly this, way many times, and had survived those failures, learned from them, and built the logistical systems that tried to prevent them from recurring. The Roman legion on the march was, by the standards of the ancient world, an extremely well-supplied force. Each soldier carried perhaps 15 days' worth of rations in a pack that weighed approximately 30 kilograms, the famous mule's load that gave Roman infantrymen their ironic nickname of Marius's mules, after the general who standardized the practice. Behind the infantry came the supply wagons, the heavy vehicles loaded with artillery, engineering equipment, and additional provisions that allowed the legion to operate independently for weeks at a time. And behind the supply wagons came the sutlers, the merchants and camp followers who sold additional food and goods to soldiers who had money to spend, creating a secondary supply system that was informal but often more responsive than the official one. This elaborate system gave the Roman army a logistical resilience that was almost unmatched in the ancient world. It could march through territory that had been stripped by a retreating enemy and still keep its soldiers fed, because its organic supply capacity was large enough to sustain it over the days and weeks needed to reach a more productive region. It could besiege cities for months because its supply wagons were full and the surrounding countryside was available for foraging. It could operate in winter, which most ancient armies could not, because it had enough provisions to sustain a campaign through the dead season. But the maritime dimension of Roman supply was far more vulnerable than the land dimension. Ships could not carry 30 days of provisions for each man. Ships had to move constantly, because a ship at anchor in a hostile anchorage was a target. Ships were dependent on the wind in ways that a column of marching soldiers was not. And when ships were destroyed, in storms, by enemy action, by the 100 accidents of maritime operation, their cargoes were irreplaceable in a way that lost land supplies often were not. A supply wagon could be replaced. A grain ship that sank with 1,000 tons of Egyptian grain was 1,000 tons of Egyptian grain gone. The fragility of the maritime supply system was Rome's deepest strategic vulnerability, and it was the one that the Roman system was least well designed to address. The great engineering achievements of the empire, the roads, the aqueducts, the harbours, were responses to different aspects of the supply problem. but none of them could change the fact that the sea was ungovernable in ways the land was not. The emperors who invested most heavily in the grain supply infrastructure, Augustus, Claudius, Trajan, were responding to a problem they could mitigate but not solve. The sea remained the sea, and the grain still had to cross it. In 480 BC, the Persian king Xerxes led the largest military force that the ancient world had yet assembled across the Hellespont and into Greece. The numbers given by Herodotus are almost certainly inflated. The claim of 1.7 million soldiers in the land army alone reflects ancient tendencies to express enormous scale, through enormous numbers rather than careful counting. But even the most conservative modern estimates suggest a force of perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 soldiers, accompanied by a fleet of perhaps 600 to 1,200 warships. This was an enormous military undertaking, and it required a logistical operation of corresponding scale and complexity. Xerxes' invasion has been told many times as a story of military and political heroism. The stand of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the burning of Athens, the naval battle at Salamis where the Greek fleet trapped and destroyed a large portion of the Persian armada in the narrow channel between the island and the Attic mainland, the retreat. It is told much less often as a logistics story, which is unfortunate, because the logistics story is in many ways more illuminating than the military one. The military outcome, Persian defeat, Greek survival, was shaped as much by the Persian supply problem as by any act of Spartan courage or Athenian cleverness. To feed 200,000 men for a day requires approximately 2 kilograms of food per man, roughly 400,000 kilograms, or 400 tons. To feed them for a month requires 12,000 tons. To feed them for the 5 months of the campaign season requires 60,000 tons. This grain does not travel by air. In the ancient world it moved by ship, by ox cart, by the backs of donkeys and mules, and by the labour of an enormous supply apparatus that is largely invisible in the historical record, but that was, in fact, the most important component of the Persian military machine. Without the supply system there was no army, the weapons, and armour and trained soldiers were meaningless without the food to keep them on their feet. Xerxes understood this, and the preparation for the invasion was meticulous in its logistical dimension. His engineers spent 2 years cutting a canal through the promontory of Athos on the Macedonian coast, a headland that had destroyed a previous Persian fleet in a storm, a reef-lined cape notorious for sudden violence, to allow his fleet to bypass it. They built not one but 2 bridges of boats across the Hellespont, each bridge made of hundreds of ships linked with cables of flax and papyrus, wide enough for cavalry and infantry columns to cross simultaneously. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes ordered the engineers responsible to be beheaded and new bridges built immediately. He also, according to Herodotus, had the Hellespont flogged with whips as punishment for its disobedience, a detail that reveals something about Persian royal theology that is both amusing and illuminating. He established supply depots at multiple points along the route, prepositioning grain and wine and other provisions at Doriscus in Thrace, at Acanthus near the canal, at various points along the Macedonian and Thessalian coast. These depots had been accumulating for 3 years before the invasion, stocked by requisitions from the territories under Persian control. They were the backbone of the campaign plan, the supply ports on land that would allow the army to keep moving without stripping every countryside it passed through, and thus alienating the local populations whose cooperation was essential to Persian rule. The fleet was the critical variable. It moved along the coast in parallel with the army, and its role was not merely to fight but to supply. The merchant ships and grain transports that accompanied the warships were the most strategically important vessels in the armada, more vital to the campaign than the triremes because without them the army would stop. When the fleet stopped, the army stopped. When the army stopped for any extended period, it began to exhaust the local food supply. The ancient armies lived off the land as much as off their supply trains, and an army the size of Xerxes could strip a region of its food with alarming speed. The naval battle of Artemisium, fought in the waters north of Euboea at roughly the same time as Thermopylae, is relevant here not primarily for its military dimensions, but for what it reveals about the Persian supply situation. The Persian fleet, having already lost significant numbers of ships to 2 storms before reaching the battle site, was operating under supply strain. The North Greek coast was not Phoenicia or Egypt. There were no prepositioned warehouses here. no supply network of Carthaginian efficiency. The fleet's supply system, designed for the relatively predictable logistics of the Eastern Mediterranean, was operating in unfamiliar waters, and the strain showed in the behaviour of the fleet commanders. The Greek fleet, in contrast, was fighting in home waters. The island of Euboea lay just to the south, rich in grain and fresh water. The nearby mainland coast had Greek ports and Greek sympathisers who could provide provisions. When the Greek fleet needed to replenish its provisions, it had options. When the Persian fleet needed to do the same, its choices were limited. Rely on the supply ships from Asia, or raid the local coastline, which it did, with a thoroughness that did not win it friends among the local Greek population. After the battles of Artemisium, where neither side achieved a decisive advantage, both fleets withdrew when word arrived of the Persian breakthrough at Thermopylae. The Persian fleet sailed south toward Athens, following the victorious army. The Greek fleet retreated toward the Saronic Gulf, and in September 480 BC, in the narrow channel between Salamis and the Attic mainland, the decisive engagement took place. The Persian defeat at Salamis is usually attributed to superior Greek tactics, Themistocles' clever manipulation of Xerxes into ordering his fleet into the narrow channel where numbers gave way to maneuverability. This is accurate as far as it goes, but the naval defeat also destroyed the supply network that the fleet had been maintaining for the army. Without the grain ships that had accompanied the armada, the army camped in Attica was dependent on local foraging, and Attica, stripped by the Athenian evacuation and the fighting, was not a productive foraging ground. Xerxes' decision to retreat was driven at least partly by the supply situation. The great army that had crossed the Hellespont in triumph was, by the autumn of 480 BC, beginning to face a provisioning crisis that would worsen with the onset of winter. The final defeat of Mardonius, whom Xerxes left behind in Greece with a reduced force, at Plataea the following year was similarly shadowed by logistics. Mardonius based himself at Thebes, which was grain-rich and friendly to the Persian side, and spent weeks manoeuvring around the Greek army without engaging, precisely because he could supply his army from Boeotian resources while avoiding the decisive battle. When Greek cavalry began interdicting the supply convoys bringing food from Boeotia, and when a convoy of 500 supply camels was captured, Mardonius found his position untenable. He was forced to attack. The battle, when it came, went badly for the Persians. But the decision to fight at all was a decision driven by hunger, as much as by strategy. The quartermaster's victory at Plataea is not what the history books celebrate, but the evidence strongly suggests it was decisive. On the morning of July 11th, 1405, a fleet of extraordinary proportions assembled in the port of Nanjing and prepared to sail into the South China Sea. The ships were unlike anything the world had yet produced. The largest of them, the so-called treasure ships, Bao, Chuan, may have been as long as 120 metres and as wide as 50 metres, 4 times the length of the largest European ships of the same period, roughly comparable in size to a modern destroyer. They had 9 masts, red silk sails and hulls divided into watertight compartments that made them far more resilient to damage than any European vessel of the era. They were painted in brilliant colours and decorated with carved dragon prows, and they carried, in addition to vast quantities of trade goods, live animals from across Asia, diplomatic missions, soldiers, physicians, astronomers, translators, and everything necessary for a self-sustaining floating civilization that could operate for months without returning to port. This was the first of what became known as the treasure fleet voyages of Zheng He, a Chinese Muslim eunuch admiral who served the Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty, and who led 7 extraordinary expeditions across the Indian Ocean between 1405 and 1433. The voyages went to Southeast Asia, to India, to the Persian Gulf and the courts of Arabia, to the Red Sea ports through which spice and silk had traded for millennia, and ultimately to the east coast of Africa, an achievement of navigational ambition that is still not fully appreciated in standard Western histories of exploration. While Portuguese explorers were still cautiously feeling their way down the African coast, Zheng He was already trading in East African ports and bringing back giraffes to present to the emperor in Beijing. What made these voyages possible, in logistical terms, was the Indian Ocean monsoon. The word monsoon comes from the Arabic mausim, meaning season, and the seasonal wind system of the Indian Ocean is one of the most reliable meteorological patterns on Earth. From approximately April to October, winds blow strongly from the southwest, carrying moisture from the ocean across India and into Southeast Asia. From approximately October to April, the winds reverse, blowing from the northeast. This reversal is so regular, so predictable, that Indian Ocean sailors had been exploiting it for trade for at least 2,000 years before Zheng He set sail. Arab and Indian traders and the sailors of the Indonesian archipelago had built entire commercial civilizations on the monsoon's dependability. You sailed east on the northeast monsoon and west on the southwest monsoon, and if you were in the right place at the right time, the wind did most of the work for you. The scale of the Indian Ocean trading world that Zheng He was entering, and in some ways reorganizing around Chinese imperial interests, is often underappreciated in histories that focus on the European age of exploration. By the time the treasure fleets arrived in the ports of Calicut and Hormuz and Aden and Malindi, those ports had been thriving commercial centres for centuries. The great Arab geographers and navigators, Ibn Battuta, who had visited Calicut in the 1340s, al-Idrisi, who had mapped the Indian Ocean coasts, Ibn Majid himself, who wrote treatises on Indian Ocean navigation that were the definitive technical documents of the field, had described and codified a trading world of extraordinary complexity. Silks and ceramics moved from China to Hormuz and thence to the Mediterranean. Spices moved from the Moluccas and the Malabar coast to Arabia and Egypt. Cotton textiles moved in both directions. Gold moved south from East Africa. Ivory moved north. It was a fully integrated commercial world, operating across distances that most people in medieval Europe could not have imagined, and it had been running smoothly, interrupted only by occasional piracy and political disruption, for hundreds of years. Zheng He's treasure fleets did not discover this world. They entered it as the representatives of the most powerful state on earth, a China under the dynamic Yongle Emperor that was, by any measure, the greatest military and commercial power of the 15th century, and they reorganized it around the principle of tribute to the Ming Emperor. The local rulers who received Zheng He's diplomats were expected to acknowledge Chinese suzerainty, to send tribute to Beijing, and in return to receive Chinese goods, Chinese protection, and Chinese recognition of their legitimacy. It was diplomacy backed by the most impressive naval force in the world, and it was, for the most part, effective. The provisioning of the treasure fleets was a logistical achievement that rivaled their navigational one. The fleets carried perhaps 27,000 men on the largest voyages: sailors, soldiers, diplomats, physicians, astronomers, translators, and hundreds of artisans and craftsmen who maintained the ships and produced the goods for trade. Feeding 27,000 men for a voyage of 8 to 12 months required a supply system of considerable sophistication. The Chinese solved part of this problem with the design of the ships themselves. The largest, treasure ships carried freshwater tanks and garden plots, live animals, and the seeds and soil to grow fresh vegetables during the voyage. They were, in effect, floating farms as well as floating palaces, and this innovation kept the crew significantly healthier than the European sailors of the same period who had no access to fresh food after the first few weeks at sea. The trading ports along the route were also supply ports, and the relationships Zheng He cultivated in them were as much about provisioning as about diplomacy. A friendly port meant fresh water, fresh food, the ability to careen and repair ships, and the knowledge of the local winds and currents that only residents could provide. A hostile port, like Ceylon under Alagonakara, meant all of those things denied. The Ceylon incident demonstrated that the supply dimension of the diplomatic mission was not secondary to the political one. They were the same thing. Zheng He's fleet was designed around the monsoon. The voyagers departed at the right time of year to catch the northeast monsoon south across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean, and they returned on the southwest monsoon. This was not merely convenient, it was essential. The treasure fleet could not beat against the monsoon any more than it could sail on dry land. The monsoon was the invisible road, and the fleet was simply following it, if you caught it correctly. The problem was that the monsoon would not wait. The window for departure for catching the wind at its most favourable was measured in weeks. Miss it, and the fleet was stranded, unable to proceed to its destination, unable to return home, sitting in whatever intermediate port it had reached with provisions running down and the clock ticking toward the reversal of the wind. The supply calculation for a treasure fleet voyage was inseparable from the wind calculation. You needed to have enough provisions to reach the next major port before the monsoon shifted, and you needed to be in the right port when it shifted, so that the return journey was also viable. It was a calculation made on multiple timescales simultaneously, requiring the coordination of meteorological knowledge, navigational skill, and logistics that the Ming Imperial Navy had spent decades developing. It was during the third voyage, in 1409, that Zheng He faced a crisis that came very close to the supply port nightmare, and that led to one of the more dramatic episodes in the remarkable history of these expeditions. The fleet had reached the island of Ceylon, the great teardrop-shaped landmass at the tip of the Indian subcontinent, now known as Sri Lanka. Ceylon was one of the most important stopping points on the Indian Ocean trade route, a place where east-west traffic converged and where merchants from Arabia, India, Southeast Asia and China all met. Its ports were rich, its ruler was powerful, and its position made it almost unavoidable for any fleet navigating the Indian Ocean. The king of Ceylon at the time was Alagonakara, a ruler whom the Chinese sources describe in unflattering terms: ambitious, hostile, and unwilling to acknowledge the suzerainty of the Ming emperor in the way that Zheng He's diplomatic mission required. The negotiations broke down. According to Chinese accounts, the king attempted to ambush the treasure fleet, cutting off its access to fresh water and provisions, while sending his army to deal with the Chinese force encamped on shore. Zheng He found himself in the position of a fleet commander who could not provision his ships and could not safely leave. His response was of breathtaking audacity. Rather than attempting to fight through to the ships, he left a small force to hold the camp and took his main fighting force directly to the king's capital, bypassing the army entirely. His soldiers broke through the city's defences, captured the king himself along with his family and principal ministers, and then held them hostage while the situation on the shore was resolved. With the king as a prisoner, the army threatening the fleet had no orders and no political authority. The fresh water and provisions were restored. The fleet loaded and departed before the monsoon window closed entirely. This episode illuminates the supply port problem from an angle that the purely physical accounts of provisioning tend to miss: the political dimension. Sometimes the port existed, the provisions existed, but a human decision, a king's pride, a local ruler's calculation of advantage, stood between the fleet and what it needed. In those circumstances, the response could not be patience. Patience meant the monsoon passing, meant weeks of waiting while provisions dwindled, meant arriving at the next port too late in the season to continue. Zheng He responded with force, and the force was decisive. The treasure fleet voyages carried with them an innovation in the supply problem that deserves attention. The largest treasure ships apparently carried, in addition to stored provisions, live animals for fresh meat, cattle, goats, chickens, and maintained garden plots of soil in which fresh vegetables and herbs were grown continuously during the voyage. This was not a new idea in Asian maritime tradition, but it was applied at a scale that European ships of the period would not achieve for another century. The Chinese understanding that scurvy, the disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that would later devastate European expeditions, was connected to the absence of fresh food, and that this could be partially addressed by growing food on board, was experiential rather than theoretical. They did not know why fresh ginger and green onions and citrus prevented the disease. They knew only that they did, and they acted accordingly. Zheng He died during the seventh voyage, in 1433, somewhere along the Indian Ocean route. The treasure fleet voyages ended afterward, and the ships rotted, in port. The navigation charts, the logs, the accumulated knowledge, much of it was deliberately destroyed by a conservative faction within the Ming bureaucracy that saw the voyages as extravagant. The detailed knowledge of supply ports along the Indian Ocean routes was lost with them. It would be recreated at enormous cost in lives and suffering by Portuguese sailors who had to learn the same lessons without the benefit of Chinese knowledge. Vasco da Gama left Lisbon on July 8, 1497, with 4 ships, approximately 170 men, and the intention of sailing around Africa to reach India. He was not the first European to try this route. His predecessor Bartolomeo Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving it was possible to sail from the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. But Dias had been turned back by a crew that had simply refused to continue. exhausted and frightened after months at sea in the storm-lashed waters of the far south, and no European ship had made it, all the way to India. Da Gama was going to be the first. The route around Africa was not short. From Lisbon to the Cape of Good Hope is roughly 8,000 miles. From the Cape to Calicut on the Indian Malabar coast is another 5,000 miles. Total, 13,000 miles of sailing, most of it in waters for which there were no European charts, no established supply posts, and only the vaguest knowledge of currents, winds, and the political complexities of the ports they would need to use. Da Gama carried provisions for approximately 6 months of sailing, a serious and careful provisioning, reflecting the experience of the earlier Portuguese voyages and the understanding that this was going to be an unusually long time at sea. He also took trade goods, cloth, glass beads, tin, coral, and other items that the Portuguese hoped would function as acceptable currency in whatever markets they found. What he could not carry was knowledge. He did not know where the good anchorages were on the East African coast. He did not know the political alignments of the coastal rulers. He did not know which diseases would affect his crew, and he did not know that the supply crisis he would face during the return journey would bring his fleet closer to dissolution than any storm. The outward voyage was a tour de force of seamanship. Da Gama made a bold decision early in the voyage, swinging far out into the Atlantic to find the westerly winds that would push him toward the Cape, a decision that had him out of sight of land for 93 days, the longest time any European fleet had spent at sea without a port stop up to that point. When he finally reached the Cape, his crew was shaken and scurvy was beginning to show among the weakest men. He put into a bay on the South African coast, later named St. Helena Bay, careened his ships, filled his water casks, and killed seals for fresh meat. This resupply was critical. The water from the Atlantic crossing had not been good, and the men needed fresh food. From there, the fleet turned north along the East African coast, entering the Indian Ocean trading world that Zheng He had known well, and that Da Gama was discovering fresh. The Swahili coast, the string of merchant cities and trading harbours that ran from what is now Mozambique northward through Tanzania and Kenya, was wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply connected to the Arabic and Indian commercial networks that had operated there for centuries. It was also, from the Portuguese perspective, complicated. These were not desperate wilderness peoples who might be overawed by European technology. These were urban merchants with their own political structures, their own commercial interests, and their own well-founded skepticism about the intentions of armed foreign ships arriving from an unexpected direction. At Mozambique, the Portuguese were received with caution that curdled into hostility when the Sultan realised Gama's fleet was not an Arab trading expedition. As they left, the Portuguese fired their bombards at the town. At Mombasa, there was another tense encounter, and another departure under fire. The fleet was sailing through a world full of ports and provisions, and it could not reliably access them because the relationships were wrong. The political supply problem was as serious as the physical one. The exception was Malindi. The Sultan of Malindi, for reasons that his own records do not fully explain, possibly rivalry with Mombasa, possibly a calculation that the Portuguese might be useful allies, extended hospitality. He provided fresh provisions, cattle, fruit, vegetables in quantities that allowed the crew to begin recovering from the early signs of scurvy. And then he provided the one thing that the entire voyage most needed, a pilot. The pilot's name is given in the Portuguese records as Malamocana. Some scholars, drawing on later Arabic sources, have identified him with the great Arab navigator and geographical theorist Ahmad ibn Majid, who wrote extensively about Indian Ocean navigation. The identification is disputed. But whoever he was, he knew the Indian Ocean in the way that comes from a lifetime of sailing it, and he agreed to guide Da Gama's fleet from Malindi to Calicut. The crossing, approximately 2,400 miles, took 23 days, with the monsoon behind them, and they arrived at Calicut in late May 1498. The significance of the Malindi stop was not merely that it provided food and water and a pilot. It was that it provided all three at the same moment, when all three were simultaneously critical. The fleet had been at sea in unfamiliar waters for 10 months. The crew was beginning to weaken. The captain's knowledge of what lay ahead was almost entirely theoretical. A single generous port at the right moment, transformed an expedition that might have turned back into one that became the hinge of history. But the return voyage demonstrated the full and terrible price that the supply calculation could exact. Da Gama lingered in India longer than he had planned, delayed by difficult and occasionally hostile negotiations with the Zamorin of Calicut. He finally left in late August 1498, heading back across the Indian Ocean toward Africa. He had missed the favourable monsoon window by weeks. The crossing that had taken 23 days on the outward voyage took 3 months on the return. For 3 months his fleet fought headwinds and contrary currents, becalmed for days at a time, then struggling forward, then becalmed again. During those 3 months, without any possibility of making port, the men began to die. Scurvy moves slowly at first. In its early stages it manifests as fatigue and mild joint pain, which sailors in any era would attribute to hard work and not think much of. After several weeks without vitamin C, the fatigue becomes prostration, the joint pain becomes severe, the gums begin to swell and turn dark, the skin bruises at the lightest touch. Old wounds, cuts and scratches that had healed months ago, reopen as the connective tissue slowly fails, because vitamin C is essential for the synthesis of collagen, and without collagen, the body begins literally to come apart. In the final stages, the sufferer loses teeth, loses coherent thought, loses the ability to stand. Death, when it comes, can come from any of the secondary effects, bleeding, infection, heart failure, but it comes. By the time Da Gama's fleet made landfall on the East African coast after the endless crossing, 30 of his original 170 men were dead or dying. He was forced to burn one of his 4 ships, the Saint Raphael, because there were no longer enough men healthy enough to crew it. The surviving ships were sailing with skeleton crews, many of them too weak to handle sails efficiently, the officers doing the work of common sailors and the common sailors doing what they could. They reached Malindi again. The Sultan gave them what they needed: fresh provisions, rest, and most importantly fruit. Oranges and lemons in quantities large enough for the crew to begin to recover. Within days, men who had been unable to walk were standing. Wounds that had been weeping closed. The recovery of men in the advanced stages of scurvy when supplied with fresh citrus is one of the most dramatic recoveries in medicine, occurring so rapidly that it genuinely resembles a miracle to those who see it for the first time. Da Gama's sailors were experiencing it without any theoretical understanding of why it was happening. They knew only that the fruit was doing something extraordinary. Da Gama arrived back in Lisbon in September 1499, with 2 ships and perhaps 55 surviving men out of his original fleet of 4 ships and 170 crew. It was celebrated as a triumph, because the route was proved and the commercial potential was demonstrated. The spices he brought back were worth a fortune. The King of Portugal understood that an ocean route to Asia had been opened, and that Portugal intended to control it. But the dead were still dead, and the lesson that Da Gama's voyage taught, about the supply of fresh provisions, about the necessity of the citrus fruit that would eventually be identified as the cure for scurvy, took another 2 centuries to be formally recognised and acted upon by European navies. In the meantime, tens of thousands of sailors on the Portuguese, Dutch, English and Spanish routes to Asia would die of the same disease, in the same agony, missing the same supply that would have saved them. In 1602, a group of Dutch merchants who had been competing ferociously against each other for control of the enormously profitable spice trade did something that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. They agreed to cooperate. They merged their individual ventures into a single entity, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, known universally by its initials, the VOC. The Dutch States General granted this new company a monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan, which is to say, essentially the entire Indian and Pacific Oceans. They also granted it powers that went well beyond commercial privilege: the right to make war, to negotiate treaties, to administer justice, to build fortresses and maintain armies. The VOC was, in essence, a private company with sovereign authority over half the world's ocean surface, and it became the most profitable commercial enterprise of the 17th century. The VOC's genius was not merely commercial, it was logistical. The Heeren 17, the 17 lords who governed the company from Amsterdam, thought about the route from the Netherlands to Asia not as a single journey, but as a series of discrete supply problems, each requiring its own solution. The mathematics were clear, if brutal. The voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia, modern Jakarta, took approximately 6 to 8 months in each direction. A ship that left Amsterdam needed to carry provisions for the full voyage, because the alternative, stopping at various ports along the way where prices might be high and quality uncertain, added time and cost. The VOC preferred to carry everything it needed and stop only where it had established its own supply infrastructure. The Cape of Good Hope was the obvious pivot point. In 1652, the VOC sent Jan van Riebeek with 3 ships and 90 settlers to the Cape with instructions to establish a refreshment station, not a colony, explicitly not a colony, but a garden and a slaughterhouse and a water supply, maintained for the sole purpose of provisioning VOC ships on the passage between Europe and Asia. Van Riebeek set up his small fort on the eastern shore of Table Bay, planted his garden, imported cattle from the indigenous Khoikhoi pastoralists, and opened the book that would eventually become the history of South Africa. The refreshment station grew, despite the VOC's explicit intentions, into a colony. But its function, as a supply port, a place where ships could stop and heal their sick and fill their water casks and take on fresh meat and vegetables, remained its most important role for as long as the VOC existed. Batavia itself, positioned at the northwest corner of Java, built on swampy ground around the mouth of the Siliwung River, was the VOC's central hub in Asia. Everything flowed through it. The spices from the Moluccas, the textiles from the Coromandel coast of India, the silk and porcelain from China, the tin from Malacca, the pepper from Malabar and Bantam. Ships came from Amsterdam laden with silver coin and manufactured goods, and left laden with Asian commodities that would be sold at enormous profit in European markets. The rhythm of the VOC's commercial empire was organised around the movements of its ships between Amsterdam, the Cape, and Batavia, with subsidiary routes branching out to every significant port from Japan to the Persian Gulf. The mathematics of this system were maintained with remarkable precision, and they were cold. The VOC calculated, with ledger book clarity, what it cost to send ships from Amsterdam to Batavia and back. It calculated the mortality rates among its sailors and soldiers. Men died on these voyages at rates that would seem horrifying by any modern standard, and the VOC knew this not as an abstraction, but as a line item in its accounts. The average mortality on the outward voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia in the 17th century was roughly 12 to 15%. In bad years, or on particular ships, it was much higher. In 1643, one ship lost 77 men out of 200 on the outward passage alone. The causes of death were multiple and interconnected. Scurvy, which the VOC, despite the accumulated evidence of 2 centuries of observation, had still not effectively addressed, took the lives of men who had been perfectly healthy when they left Amsterdam, and who had simply spent too long at sea without fresh food. Dysentery, spread through contaminated water and the appalling sanitary conditions of a crowded ship, killed men quickly and horribly. Malaria, contracted during stops on the West African coast or in Batavia itself, carried off thousands. Typhoid, typhus, pneumonia, and the various fevers that early modern medicine lumped together under names like ship fever and jail fever completed the picture. The VOC addressed these causes not by solving them. It had neither the medical knowledge to understand most of them nor, honestly, the motivation to investigate them thoroughly when the supply of willing recruits remained adequate, but by incorporating their effects into its planning. If you needed to arrive in Batavia with 150 able-bodied men to replace the garrison and serve the trading factory, you left Amsterdam with 200. The 20% surplus was the expected mortality, the human cost of the distance, the price paid to the sea for the privilege of the spice trade. It was incorporated into the business plan. This is perhaps the most disturbing application of supply chain logic in the pre-modern world. The VOC was treating human lives as a consumable resource in exactly the same way it treated rope and sailcloth and biscuit. There was a planned wastage. There was a calculation of acceptable loss. The men who died of scurvy in the hold of a VOC ship somewhere in the South Atlantic, or who were buried at sea off the coast of Madagascar, or who died of fever in the hospital at Batavia within weeks of arrival, were in the company's ledgers a cost of doing business, statistically foreseeable, financially accounted for, and in the end unremarkable. What the VOC did understand, with great practical intelligence, was the geography of its supply problems. It knew exactly where the critical resupply points were and how important it was to maintain them. The Cape was not merely useful, it was essential. A ship that arrived at the Cape in poor condition, short of provisions with a sick crew with damaged rigging, could be repaired and revictualled and sent on its way. A ship that arrived at Batavia in poor condition with a crew too small to work it had failed the calculation, had consumed the surplus, had arrived as a problem rather than a solution. The VOC spent considerable resources ensuring that the Cape station was well maintained and well supplied, because the Cape was the difference between the ships arriving and not arriving. The route to Japan, the northernmost extension of the VOC's network, was the most logistically demanding. Japanese law confined Dutch traders to the island of Deshima in Nagasaki harbour, a tiny artificial island barely 200 metres long and 80 metres wide, surrounded by water and accessible only via a guarded bridge to the shore. The Dutch were not permitted to set foot on Japanese soil under any circumstances whatsoever. The supply of Deshima was an annual operation, a small fleet from Batavia, carrying the goods that Japan wanted and returning with Japanese goods in exchange. The voyage from Batavia to Nagasaki crossed the South China Sea and the waters around the Philippines and up through the Ryukyu Islands, a route with few VOC supply posts along the way, dependent on maintaining good relations with ports that were not always cooperative and navigating seas that were not always well charted. The VOC sailed this route for nearly 2 centuries, from 1641 until 1799, when the company itself was dissolved. Through famines and monsoon failures and sea battles and all the ordinary disasters of maritime operation, the annual ship arrived at Deshima with the goods the Japanese trading house needed. It was one of the most remarkable sustained logistical operations in the history of commerce, and its success depended entirely on the careful management of the supply chain at every step of the route, from the warehouses of Amsterdam to the guarded bridge of Deshima. There is a particular cruelty to the Arctic as a theatre of the supply port problem, and it is this: the cold that preserves food and prevents the decay, that ruins provisions in warm climates, also kills the men who need those provisions. The ice that blocks the passage also prevents the supply ships from arriving. The polar night that slows bacterial growth also slows everything else, including the human capacity to think clearly about what to do next. The Arctic is a place where the supply problem does not merely develop gradually. It crystallizes, hard and clear and final as the ice itself, and then it does not melt until the season is ready to permit it, regardless of the urgency of human need. Henry Hudson was an English navigator of considerable skill and considerable reputation, employed successively by the Muscovy Company of London and the Dutch East India Company in search of a navigable route to Asia through the northern seas. He made 4 voyages in search of this passage. The first 2 were attempts to sail north of Scandinavia, into the Arctic Ocean, looking for a northeast passage that would take him through Russian waters and into the Pacific. Both were turned back by ice. The third voyage, in 1609, took a different approach. He sailed west, across the Atlantic, and investigated the North American coast for a passage. He found the river that now bears his name, sailed up it to the area of modern Albany, New York, and was the first European to explore the Hudson Valley systematically. He did not find the passage to Asia, but he opened a river that would become one of the most commercially significant waterways in the Americas. His 4th voyage, in 1610, was the one that ended in the bay that also bears his name. He departed from London in April with the ship Discovery and a crew of approximately 23 men, including several who had sailed with him before. The Discovery was a small vessel, perhaps 55 tons burthen, not a large ship even by the standards of its era. It carried provisions for perhaps 8 months, generous by the standards of the time, reflecting the uncertainty about how long the voyage might take. Hudson sailed northwest, found the strait between Labrador and Baffin Island that now bears his name, and entered the great inland sea beyond in August 1610. He spent the autumn sailing around the bay, probing its coasts and inlets for the western passage that he was convinced must exist. He did not find it. As October turned to November, the signs of winter, the increasing cold, the new ice forming on the water, the shortening days, became undeniable. the Discovery could not make its way back through the now freezing strait in time to reach open water. In November 1610, it was frozen in on the eastern shore of James Bay, the broad southern arm of Hudson Bay, and it could not move. They were to remain frozen in until June 1611. 9 months. The provisions carried for 8 months were not adequate for 9, especially 9 months in which the crew was confined and cold and increasingly ill. Hudson tried to supplement the ship's stores through hunting and fishing, organising shore parties to catch ptarmigan and other birds, to fish through holes cut in the ice, to gather what edible plants they could find along the frozen shoreline. They found moss and a plant that the surviving accounts called Thomas's Fetch, which was probably a form of wild herb. These additions helped, but they were not adequate substitutes for the bread and salt meat that formed the backbone of the crew's diet. What made the situation worse was Hudson's management of the provisions, or rather, the crew's perception of his management. The accounts that survive were written by men who had reason to present Hudson in an unflattering light, so they must be read carefully. But the consistent thread across all of them is a belief among the crew that Hudson was distributing the provisions unfairly, that he was keeping better rations for himself and his favourites while giving others inadequate shares. Whether this was objectively true, or was a distorted perception born of hunger and resentment, it had the same effect. It destroyed the trust between the captain and his crew. By the spring of 1611, as the ice began to break up and the Discovery prepared to sail, the tension had become unbearable. The crew's condition was poor, men were sick, provisions were dangerously low, and the tempers of men confined for months in a small wooden ship in the cold were frayed beyond repair. On June 22nd, 1611, a group of men led by Henry Green overpowered Hudson, his young son John, the ship's carpenter Robert Bylot, and several sick men, and forced them into the ship's small boat, the shallop, a small open craft perhaps 20 feet long. They were given a small amount of food, some gunpowder and shot, and set adrift in Hudson Bay. Hudson and the 7 men in the shallop were never seen again. The mutineers sailed the Discovery home, losing several more men to a violent encounter with Inuit people on the eastern shore of the bay. They arrived in London in September 1611, ragged and depleted, having crossed the North Atlantic with a crew too small to properly man the ship. Most of them escaped serious punishment. They were the only men alive who had navigated Hudson Strait, and the merchants who were funding the continuing search for a northwest passage valued their knowledge more than they valued the rule of law. Henry Green, who was killed in the encounter with the Inuit and thus could not testify at all, bore most of the posthumous blame. What the Hudson Bay incident reveals about the supply port problem goes beyond the obvious arithmetic of too little food for too long a time. It reveals the social and psychological dimensions of supply crisis in confined spaces. The ship was a community as much as a vessel, and the community had rules, both formal naval rules and informal social contracts about fairness and sharing that were, in some ways, more binding than the formal ones. When supply became scarce enough that those informal contracts seemed to be breaking down, when some men felt they were going hungry while others were adequately fed, the social structure of the ship began to break. The mutiny was not simply about the provisions. It was about the sense that the provisions were not being shared according to the principles that made communal survival possible. The bay that Hudson died in bears his name. The company that would eventually trade across those same frozen waters, the Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, built its own supply forts along the shores, the carefully stocked fur trading posts at Fort Albany and Fort Severn and York Factory that would sustain the northern trade for 2 centuries. But Henry Hudson never saw them, never knew that the bay where he died would eventually be ringed with warehouses. He reached a place where there were no supply ports and no possibility of creating one in time, and in that place, the worst of human nature had met the worst of human circumstance. At the beginning of June 1812, the Grande Armée of Napoleon Bonaparte numbered somewhere between 450,000 and 600,000 men, assembled along the banks of the Niemen River on the border of the Duchy of Warsaw and the Russian Empire. It was the largest army ever assembled in European history to that point, drawn from the length and breadth of the French Empire and its satellite states. French and Polish and Italian and German and Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch soldiers all in the service of the most brilliant military mind of the age. Napoleon had spent the winter of 1811 to 1812 thinking carefully about the supply problem. He had organised the establishment of supply depots at Danzig, at Königsberg, at Vilna, at Vitebsk, at Smolensk, a chain of storehouses that would allow his army to advance deep into Russia without relying entirely on local foraging. He had arranged for mobile bakeries, ovens mounted on wheels, that would travel with the army and bake bread from the grain they expected to find in Russia's vast agricultural interior. He had calculated with his characteristic mathematical precision the provisions required to sustain his army for the months of the campaign. The calculations failed from the first day. The roads of Russia were not French roads. They were not German roads. They were, for the most part, not roads in any meaningful sense. They were tracks across the steppe, passable in dry weather and impassable in wet. In the summer of 1812, which was unusually hot and dry, the tracks turned to dust. The dust rose in suffocating clouds around the marching columns, settling on food and water supplies, coating the lungs of men and animals alike. The horses, which were already being worked beyond reasonable limits to haul the enormous artillery train and the supply wagons, began to break down and die. Horses that died could not haul wagons. Wagons that could not move could not supply men. Men who were not supplied by wagons had to forage locally or go without, and the Russian army would not cooperate. Napoleon had built the entire campaign plan around the expectation of a decisive early battle, something like Austerlitz or Jena, where the French military machine would catch the Russian army, defeat it comprehensively, and force Alexander to negotiate. Instead, the Russians retreated. They retreated at Vilna, at Vitebsk, at Smolensk, pulling back always just far enough to avoid the encirclement that Napoleon needed to force. And as they retreated, they burned. Not everything. The policy was applied unevenly and incompletely, but enough. Grain stores were fired, bridges were destroyed, cattle were driven away. The countryside through which the Grande Armée advanced was not empty, but it was stripped of exactly the resources that the army most needed. By the time the army reached Smolensk in August, it had already paid an enormous price. The 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen 6 weeks earlier had been reduced to perhaps 180,000 effective fighting soldiers. The rest were dead, of typhus, of dysentery, of heat stroke in the strange summer heat wave, or sick, or straggling. They had died faster than any battle had killed them, and they had died mostly of the supply problem in various forms. The supply wagons were stuck in the mud or had been abandoned when the horses died. The mobile bakeries were not producing bread because the grain had not been collected as planned. The men were eating less than they needed, and some were eating almost nothing. Smolensk was the supply depot that was meant to refuel the army for the final push to Moscow. The city was partially burning when the French entered it. The Russians had fired parts of it before withdrawing, and the supplies there were less than Napoleon had planned for. There was grain, but not enough, and some of it was burned. There was not the comprehensive resupply that the campaign plan had called for. Napoleon paused at Smolensk and faced a decision that every subsequent historian has identified as the turning point of the campaign. The army was in bad condition. The supply situation was difficult. The Russian army was still undefeated and still retreating eastward. Winter was coming. Every experienced officer in the Armée, Murat, Ney, Berthier, Davout, counselled against continuing. They recommended wintering at Smolensk, reorganising the supply system, and resuming the campaign in the spring from a position of restored strength. Napoleon pressed on. His reasoning was simple and catastrophically wrong. Moscow was the prize that would force the issue. Take Moscow, and Alexander would negotiate. The campaign would end. The supply problem would solve itself. The city was 280 miles further east. The Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7th, 1812, was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russian army fought and then withdrew, not defeated, still capable of fighting, still retreating in good order. Moscow lay open. Napoleon entered it on September 14th. It was empty. The city had been systematically evacuated. The warehouses and supply depots that Napoleon had expected were gone or burning. The city itself began to burn in the days after the French entered. Fires started, deliberately or accidentally, that consumed most of its wooden buildings. Napoleon sat in the charred Kremlin and waited for Alexander to send peace terms. Alexander did not send terms. He did not send anything. He simply waited. October came, the first frost came, Napoleon sent peace proposals, Alexander ignored them. The army in Moscow, deprived of fresh supplies in the burned city, began to deteriorate. The horses were dying of starvation. There was no forage in a burned city, and without horses the army was immobile. The men were alive, but not in fighting condition. The magnificent machine that had crossed the Niemen in June was rusting from within. The retreat began on October 19th. What followed is among the most horrifying military catastrophes in human history. The army that had arrived at Moscow with perhaps 100,000 effective soldiers left in reasonable order, but the weather deteriorated quickly and viciously. Snow fell earlier than expected. Temperatures dropped sharply. The soldiers, most of whom had no adequate winter clothing, the supply system had not extended to winter uniforms because the campaign was supposed to be over before winter, began to freeze. The horses, already weakened, died by the thousands in the cold. Without horses, artillery could not be moved. Without artillery, the army lost much of its tactical capability. The last major supply depot on the retreat was at Smolensk, which the army reached in November in desperate need of resupply. The provisions that had been stored there were still there, but there were far too many men trying to take them, in conditions of chaos that the officers could no longer control. Soldiers fought each other for bread. Units that should have waited their turn simply broke into the warehouses and took what they could carry. The distribution was neither organised nor equitable, and the result was that some units received adequate provisions and others received almost nothing, and the retreat from Smolensk continued with the army no better organised and no better supplied than before. The final crossing of the Berezina River, in late November, in temperatures of -20°C, with Russian armies pressing on both flanks, was the last great disaster of the campaign. The bridges collapsed under the weight of the retreating masses. Thousands drowned in the icy river. Thousands more died on the banks, unable to cross. The survivors staggered west, and the road behind them was lined with men who had simply stopped, lay down in the snow and did not get up. The army that recrossed the Niemen in December numbered perhaps 100,000 people in total, most of them sick or frostbitten or both. More than 400,000 men had not returned. The supply failure had killed more of them than any battle had. When the first steam-powered warships began entering service in the early decades of the 19th century, they seemed to offer something that sailors had been dreaming of since the first man pushed a boat into the water: independence from the wind. A steam engine did not care which way the wind was blowing. It could power a ship against a gale, in a flat calm, in the fog of a windless November morning in the North Sea. The new technology promised to eliminate one of the most fundamental variables of maritime supply calculation: the uncertainty of the sailing window, the weeks spent becalmed waiting for a wind that might not come. But steam brought a new dependency that was, in some ways, more demanding than wind: coal. A sailing ship that ran out of wind stopped, which was bad. It could drift, it could wait, and eventually the wind would come back. A steamship that ran out of coal also stopped, but it stopped completely and offered no recovery mechanism. The engine was useless. Without fuel, the ship became a barge, entirely at the mercy of current and wind, the very conditions it had been designed to overcome. Coal was, in the vocabulary of maritime logistics, a supply need of unusual urgency. More demanding than food, more pressing than water, because a ship out of coal was not merely uncomfortable, it was operationally dead. The logistics implications of this shift were immediate and far-reaching. The great European navies of the 19th century began an urgent scramble to acquire coaling stations, anchorages or ports, at strategic points around the world, where coal was stockpiled and available to naval vessels. This scramble shaped the geopolitics of the century in ways that are not always fully recognised. Many of the places where Britain, France, Germany and later the United States established military or commercial presences in the Victorian era were chosen not primarily for their commercial value or their political significance, but for their position on the map relative to the sailing routes of steam warships. Aden, at the entrance to the Red Sea, is the canonical example. It was a small, dusty, volcanic outpost, with almost no natural resources and a history as a minor trading port in the Gulf of Aden. In commercial terms, there was nothing there worth having, but it sat precisely at the narrowest point between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. the bottleneck through which any ship travelling between the Mediterranean and Asia via the Suez route had to pass. Britain seized Aden in 1839, and the strategic logic was coal. A coaling station at Aden gave the Royal Navy the ability to travel from Britain to India without depending on any other power for fuel, which meant that no other power could hold that supply chain hostage in the event of a conflict. The supply port, again, was the key to everything else. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869 after 10 years of construction, was the greatest single act of supply chain engineering of the 19th century. It reduced the route from Britain to India by approximately 4,000 miles, eliminating the need to sail around Africa. For steamships, this was transformative. Less distance meant less coal consumed, smaller bunkers required, faster voyages, fewer opportunities for supply crises. The canal did not merely shorten the route. It made a large class of ships, which had been too small to carry adequate coal for the African route, suddenly viable for the Asian trade. It democratized the India route, in a sense, by making it accessible to ships that could not previously have managed it. But the canal also created a new vulnerability. It was a single point of failure. If the Suez Canal was closed, by war, by accident, by political dispute, the entire supply advantage was gone. The canal became, in strategic terms, the most important supply port in the world, and controlling it was the most important single goal of British Middle Eastern policy for the next century. Britain effectively occupied Egypt in 1882 to secure the canal, creating a situation that would not be fully resolved until the Suez Crisis of 1956. The race for coaling stations in the second half of the 19th century was, in miniature, a rehearsal for the entire geopolitical structure of the 20th century. Every significant naval power understood that a warship without a coaling network was a warship that could not operate beyond its home waters. Britain, which had the largest merchant and naval fleet in the world and the most extensive coaling network, had a structural advantage that no rival could quickly overcome. Germany, building its high seas fleet in the 1890s and 1900s as a challenge to British naval supremacy, ran immediately into the coaling problem. Its fleet was bottled in the North Sea, unable to project power into the wider world without the coaling stations that Britain had spent decades acquiring, and that Germany could not simply replicate by building ships. The ships were the least of it. The supply network was the true barrier. The United States discovered the same lesson during the Spanish-American War of 1898, when the battleship Oregon was ordered from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic to join the fleet assembling against Spain. The Oregon's 13,000-mile journey around South America took 67 days and attracted enormous public attention, partly as a demonstration of naval power, but mostly as an illustration of the problems that resulted from having a two-ocean coastline and no canal connecting the two oceans. The Oregon made it in time, but the experience was a powerful argument for both the Panama Canal and for a network of American coaling stations across the Pacific. Within 5 years, the United States had acquired Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. None of them primarily for their commercial or political value, but all of them positioned at strategic intervals on the Pacific route between the American West Coast and Asia. The supply port logic was building empires. The Falkland Islands, to take a smaller example, sit in the South Atlantic approximately 300 miles east of the southern tip of South America. They are cold, windswept, treeless, and of no commercial value whatsoever beyond the wool from their sheep. But they sit precisely at the southern gateway between the Atlantic and the Pacific, the route that ships took around Cape Horn when the Panama Canal was not yet available, and they had one of the finest natural harbours in the South Atlantic at Stanley. Britain had claimed them in 1833, over Argentine protests that have never been fully resolved. The reason was not the wool. The reason was the harbour, and what a harbour in that position meant for the supply of British ships rounding the Horn. The Battle of the Falkland Islands in December 1914, when a British squadron destroyed a German raiding force that had come to attack the British coaling station, was fought over exactly this logic. The Germans had correctly identified the Falklands coaling station as strategically important, and the British had correctly identified the defence of that station as essential to their ability to operate in the South Atlantic and South Pacific. The coal problem eventually solved itself, or rather, it was replaced by an oil problem that was in many ways similar in its structure, but vastly more demanding in its political implications. The transition from coal to oil as the primary fuel for warships happened gradually through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, driven by oil's higher energy density and the ability to refuel at sea from oil tankers rather than requiring ships to enter port. Oil-fired ships were faster, had greater range, and required smaller crews for their engineering spaces. But oil had a profound disadvantage that coal did not. It did not exist in the United Kingdom. Britain had vast domestic coal reserves. It had no significant domestic oil production at all. The decision to convert the Royal Navy to oil, driven by Winston Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty before the First World War, was therefore simultaneously a step toward greater efficiency and a step toward greater strategic vulnerability. The supply port problem was not eliminated. It was relocated from coaling stations to oil fields, and the oil fields were in Persia and Mesopotamia and eventually Arabia, places that Britain would have to control or cooperate with if it wished to fuel its fleet. The Middle East policy of Britain and later of the United States throughout the 20th century was in significant part a supply port policy. The oil fields of the Persian Gulf were the last supply port that industrial civilization required, the one resource that could not be substituted or done without. The wars and interventions and alliances that followed from this reality are still being worked out in the 21st century. The supply port logic, which had built the Carthaginian trading network and the VOC's global empire, and the British coaling station network, had by the mid-20th century become the organising principle of the entire global political order. On February 4th, 1915, the German Admiralty announced that the waters surrounding the British Isles constituted a war zone, and that any merchant ship found in those waters, whether Allied or neutral, was liable to be sunk without warning. It was a declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare, and its implications for the British supply situation were clear to anyone who had thought carefully about the geography of British dependence on imported food. Britain was an island nation that had become, over the course of the 19th century, increasingly unable to feed itself. The Industrial Revolution had drawn millions of people from the countryside into the cities where they could not grow food. The land that had fed Britain's rural population was no longer adequate to feed its industrial one. By 1914, Britain imported approximately 60% of its calories, the grain that made the bread that fed the mill workers of Lancashire, the meat that came from Argentine cattle pastures, the sugar from the Caribbean, the fat and oil from tropical sources. This food arrived by sea, and virtually all of it came through a relatively small number of ports on the western and southern coasts of England: Liverpool, Bristol, Southampton, London. The U-boats, submarines that could travel undetected beneath the surface, carrying torpedoes and deck guns, immune to the defensive measures that had protected surface shipping for centuries, were designed to attack this vulnerability. They were not meant to fight the Royal Navy in open battle. They were meant to starve Britain. They were the means by which Germany intended to make the island miss every supply port simultaneously by destroying the ships before they could arrive. The campaign developed in intense waves. The first phase, beginning in 1915, was partially restrained by diplomatic pressure. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, which killed 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, provoked a furious American response that threatened to bring the United States into the war on the Allied side. Germany backed down from unrestricted submarine warfare, resuming a more limited campaign that allowed neutral ships and passenger vessels to pass unmolested. The second phase, beginning in February 1917, was total. Germany had made the calculation, desperate and ultimately correct in its assessment of British vulnerability, but incorrect in its estimate of the timing, that it could starve Britain into surrender before the United States could intervene effectively. The calculation assigned approximately 8 months to the starvation schedule. Begin in February, achieve food crisis by October, Britain sues for peace by December. The United States would declare war, as Germany accepted, but American forces would not arrive in strength before the British collapsed. For several agonizing months in 1917, the German timetable seemed to be working. In April 1917, U-boats sank 880,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month, a rate that, if maintained, would reduce the merchant fleet below the minimum required to supply Britain within a year. The grain reserves in British warehouses, which the government had been building since 1915, fell to levels that made genuine rationing not merely possible, but imminent. Admiral Jellicoe, the first Sea Lord, told the War Cabinet in April 1917 that if the current rate of losses continued, the war would be impossible to sustain by November. He was not exaggerating. He was doing the arithmetic. The solution, the convoy system, is one of the great examples in military history of an obvious answer being resisted for non-obvious reasons. The principle was simple. Instead of sending merchant ships individually across the Atlantic, where they could be picked off by submarines one at a time, you gathered them into convoys of 30 to 40 ships and sent them across together, escorted by warships. A convoy was harder to find than individual ships, paradoxically because the ocean was vast and a convoy occupied approximately the same visual space as a single ship from a periscope. A convoy that was found could be defended, whereas an individual ship could not, and a submarine that attacked a convoy faced depth charges and gunfire from escorts, whereas a submarine attacking an individual ship faced nothing. The Admiralty had resisted convoys for months, offering various technical objections that subsequent analysis has found largely unconvincing. The true reasons for resistance seem to have been institutional. The Royal Navy's culture emphasised aggressive offensive action, and convoy escort felt defensive and passive. When the arithmetic became so stark that it was impossible to ignore, when Jellicoe told the War Cabinet that the war was in danger of being lost, the convoy system was introduced in May 1917. The results were dramatic. The rate of sinkings fell sharply. By the end of 1917, losses were still significant but no longer catastrophic. By 1918, with growing numbers of American destroyers joining the escort forces, the U-boat campaign was losing its capability to achieve its strategic objective. The supply line to Britain held. The last port remained open. The Pacific War, which ran from December 1941 to September 1945, was fundamentally a war about supply lines, a 3-year argument between the United States and Japan about who controlled the ocean highways that connected the resources of Southeast Asia to the factories and military forces that needed them. Japan had gone to war in 1941 to secure those resources, particularly the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber and tin of Malaya, and the rice of Southeast Asia. The United States was fighting to deny Japan the use of those resources and to ultimately break the supply lines that kept the Japanese war machine running. The island of Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands chain, was not a place that either side had planned to fight over. It was a large jungle-covered island with no important resources and no major population. But in July 1942, Japanese construction units began building an airfield on its northern coastal plain. The strategic implications were immediately clear in Washington. A Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would give Japanese aircraft the ability to interdict the sea lanes between the United States and Australia, cutting the supply line to the continent that was the foundation of the entire Allied Pacific strategy. Guadalcanal had to be taken and held. The American landing on August 7, 1942 captured the incomplete airfield in the first days, then began 6 months of fighting, on the island, in the air above it, and on the sea around it, that was shaped at every moment by the supply problem. The American garrison depended on sea supply for everything: food, ammunition, aviation fuel, replacement aircraft, medical supplies, reinforcements. These had to be shipped from bases hundreds of miles away and unloaded on beaches exposed to Japanese air attack. For the first weeks of the campaign, supply was so precarious that the Marines on the island were on half rations within days of landing, eating captured Japanese food when they could find it. The Japanese response to the American presence on Guadalcanal was the Tokyo Express, high-speed nocturnal supply runs by destroyers down the channel, known as the Slot, between the Solomon Islands. The destroyers would race southward after dark, arrive at Guadalcanal around midnight, unload their supplies and reinforcements in the fastest possible time, and race back north before American aircraft could find them at dawn. It was a remarkable improvisation, using the fastest warships in the Japanese Navy as cargo vessels, because the slower cargo ships were too vulnerable to the air power that the Americans had established on Henderson Field. But the Tokyo Express was never adequate. The destroyers could carry some cargo in addition to their fuel and weapons, but not nearly enough to maintain a substantial land garrison in heavy fighting. The Japanese troops on Guadalcanal received, through months of intense combat, perhaps a third to a half of the calories they needed to maintain combat effectiveness. They ate reduced rations, then further reduced rations, then whatever they could find in the jungle, ferns, berries, small animals. Men who had been among the finest soldiers in the world, veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya and the Philippines, were reduced to physical weakness so severe that coordinated night attacks became difficult to execute. The psychological dimensions of slow starvation in a jungle combat environment are difficult to convey. The Japanese soldier's code, Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded absolute endurance and contempt for physical weakness. Men were trained to believe that willpower could overcome physical limitation. On Guadalcanal, they discovered the limits of this doctrine. Willpower cannot fix the neurological and muscular deficits of malnutrition. Courage cannot restore the energy that adequate food provides. The attacks on Henderson Field, launched by men who had been eating grass and tree bark for weeks, failed not because the soldiers lacked commitment, but because they lacked the physical capacity to sustain the effort. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese troops committed to Guadalcanal, roughly 24,000 died. Approximately 5,000 of those deaths were in combat. The rest were from disease, primarily malaria and starvation, the supply port problem claiming more lives than the enemy's weapons. The American submarine campaign that ran in parallel with the island fighting achieved over 3 years exactly what the U-boats had nearly achieved against Britain: the strangulation of a maritime empire by attacking its supply lines. American submarines sank 8 million tons of Japanese shipping during the Pacific War, which was approximately 2/3 of Japan's entire merchant fleet. By 1945, Japan could not move oil from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands in adequate quantities. It could not move rice from the conquered territories to feed its cities. It could not move raw materials to the factories that were supposed to be supplying the military. The supply chain had been cut so thoroughly that Japan was, in the final months of the war, essentially fighting without the resources that had made the war seem winnable in 1941. The Japanese response to the submarine campaign was hampered by the same failure of institutional preparation that had afflicted Germany in 1914. A navy that had been built and trained for decisive fleet engagements had not invested in convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare. The Japanese merchant marine was largely unescorted throughout the early phases of the war, its ships sailing independently on regular routes that American codebreakers could often predict, without the protection that the convoy system had provided to Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Ships that might have survived with an escort were sunk because they had none. Cargoes that might have reached Japan with convoy protection ended up on the ocean floor. By 1944, the Japanese military was making decisions at every level that reflected the supply crisis. The naval battles of 1944, later Gulf in particular, the largest naval battle in history, were driven in part by Japan's desperate need to break through the American supply cordon and restore the flow of oil and materials to the home islands. The battle was fought with Japanese fleets that were already fuel limited, that could not train their aircrews properly because aviation fuel was short, that could not repair their damaged ships properly because steel and materials were short. They fought and they lost, and after later Gulf, the Japanese Navy never again posed a serious threat to American control of the Pacific. What the Pacific War ultimately demonstrated was that the supply port problem operated at every scale simultaneously. At the smallest scale, it was the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal eating grass and waiting for destroyers that never brought enough. At the medium scale, it was the Tokyo Express and the convoy debates and the submarine wolf packs working the tanker routes. At the larger scale, it was the fundamental strategic miscalculation that Japan had made in 1941, the assumption that it could conquer a resource empire and hold it against a power that could produce submarines faster than Japan could produce merchant ships, and that understood supply chain warfare in a way that Japan, for all its military brilliance in other respects, had failed to grasp. There is a particular kind of supply port problem that haunts the history of exploration, a problem more intimate and more poignant than the grand maritime and military disasters we have been discussing. It is the problem of the cache, the supply depot that was left exactly where it was supposed to be left, that was stocked with exactly what was supposed to be there, and that the men who needed it most desperately could not reach by a margin so small it seems almost deliberately cruel. Robert Burke and William Wills left Melbourne on August 20th, 1860, with 19 men, 26 camels, 23 horses, and more than 20 tons of equipment. Their expedition was the most heavily provisioned exploration venture yet attempted in Australia, generously funded by the government of Victoria and tasked with crossing the continent from south to north, a journey of approximately 3,000 kilometres through country that had been seen by no European and described by no one with any pretension to accuracy. Burke was appointed leader not for his exploration experience, which was minimal, but for his energy, his determination, and a certain quality of command presence that impressed the committee that appointed him. He was brave, impatient, and not particularly careful. Wills was the expedition's surveyor and scientist, meticulous, methodical, and much better suited for the intellectual demands of the role than for the physical and leadership demands of what would actually be required. The expedition reached Cooper's Creek, in the far northeast of South Australia, in early November 1860. Cooper's Creek was the last reliable water source before the true interior, a long seasonally flooded watercourse fringed with coolabah trees and bordered by sandhills. It was a place the expedition could use as a base, a place with enough water and enough shade to serve as the headquarters for the northern push. Burke made the decision that would define the expedition's outcome. He would take a small party, himself, Wills, John King and Charles Grey, and push north to the Gulf of Carpentaria and back as fast as possible, leaving the rest of the expedition under the command of William Brahe at the Cooper's Creek depot with instructions to wait. He set a time, 3 months. If they were not back in 3 months, Brahe could leave. The main party would carry provisions for approximately 3 months. The dash to the Gulf was an extraordinary achievement of sheer physical endurance. The 4 men reached the tidal flats at the mouth of the Flinders River in February 1861, the first Europeans to cross Australia from south to north. But the achievement had cost them enormously. The heat of the Australian summer, temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius day after day, was relentless. The ground was difficult, the going was slow, their food supplies were running short. The return was worse than the advance. Charles Grey died on April 17th, probably, of dysentery compounded by malnutrition. The 3 survivors, Burke, Wills and King, were in very poor condition, exhausted, underfed, weakened by months of extreme heat and inadequate nutrition. They staggered southward toward Cooper's Creek and the depot where Brahe was waiting with food and horses and the possibility of rescue. They arrived at Cooper's Creek on April 21st, 1861. It was evening. The camp was empty. Brahe had left 9 hours earlier. He had waited 4 months and 5 days, longer than his instructions required. His own men were sick. Their horses were weakening. He had sent no news south and received no news of Burke's party. He made the decision to go, and before he left he buried a cache of provisions at the base of a large coolabah tree, dried meat and flour and sugar and rice, enough for several weeks, and cut the word "dig" into the bark of the tree, with the date and the direction. Burke and Wills found the blaze on the tree. They dug up the cache. They ate. They read the note that Brahe had left saying he had departed, and then, in a decision that Burke made for reasons that were perhaps rational under the extreme stress and exhaustion of his condition, but that sealed all their fates, they chose not to update the blaze on the tree. They did not cut a new date into the bark. They did not leave a visible sign that the cache had been found and that they were still alive. Brahe, returning to Cooper's Creek days later with a rescue party that had been sent from Malindi, found the tree exactly as he had left it. No new mark on the bark, no evidence that anyone had been there since. He looked around, saw nothing, and turned back south. Burke and Wills, who had been at that very tree a few days before, were beyond his view in the creek bed, trying to follow the watercourse south toward the settled country. They did not make it. Burke died on June 28th, probably of starvation compounded by exhaustion. Wills died shortly afterward, also of starvation, writing in his diary almost to the end with a clarity and a scientific precision that was heartbreaking given his condition. King survived, kept alive by the Yandrawanda people, the indigenous Australians of the Cooper's Creek region, who found the emaciated young Irishman wandering in the sandhills and shared their food and their knowledge of the country with him for 2 months until a rescue party arrived. The Yandrawanda knew Cooper's Creek. They knew what to eat in it and along it, They knew where the nardoo was, a fern spore that could be ground into a kind of flour, and how to prepare it, and they shared that knowledge with King. They were, in the most direct sense, the last supply port. They were the human infrastructure of survival that Burke and Wills, in their focus on their own expedition's logistics, had not thought to cultivate. The relationship with the local people that might have saved them all, that other explorers in other parts of Australia had understood was essential, was not one that Burke had prioritised. Robert Falcon Scott's story shares certain structural features with Burke and Wills, though the setting, the scale, and the character of the men involved are all different. Scott was a methodical, intelligent, and scrupulously honest commander who planned his Antarctic expedition with care and who has been criticised, in the century since his death, for decisions that deserve more nuanced evaluation than they often receive. The British Antarctic expedition of 1910 to 1913 was planned around a carefully calculated supply chain. Scott established a series of depots on the Barrier, the great flat ice shelf that forms the floor of the Ross Sea, during the autumn of 1911, stocking them with food and fuel for the return journey from the pole. The depot positions were calculated to match the distances a reasonably fit party could cover in a day's march. The amounts of food and fuel in each depot were calculated to provide adequate sustenance for the number of men who would be returning. Scott reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912. Amundsen had been there 5 weeks earlier, leaving a tent and a Norwegian flag and a brief letter. The disappointment was enormous. The entire justification of the hazardous journey, the claim to priority, was gone. But Scott's party turned around and began the return with discipline and apparent calm. The return began to go wrong almost immediately. The weather was worse than it had been on the advance, colder by perhaps 10 degrees Celsius than the historical averages for the season. This extra cold, which would not be explained until decades later as an anomalous pattern in the Southern Ocean atmospheric system, drained the party's energy at a rate their provisions had not been designed to compensate for, because the provisions had been calculated on the basis of historical temperatures that this particular year had simply failed to deliver. The fuel in the depots had evaporated. This is a detail that is sometimes passed over quickly, but it was critical. The kerosene that Scott's party needed to melt snow for water and to cook their food had been stored in cans sealed with leather washers. Over months at extreme temperatures, the leather had contracted and the kerosene had slowly leaked away. When Scott's party reached a depot expecting to find a certain amount of fuel, they found the cans lighter than expected, lighter in some cases by a third or more of the expected volume. Without adequate fuel, they could not melt enough snow for water. Without adequate water, they could not fully reconstitute the dried food. Without adequate food, they weakened faster than the depot-to-depot distances allowed for. Edgar Evans, the biggest and strongest man in the party, died first, at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier on February 17th. Lawrence Oates, whose feet had turned black with frostbite, who was becoming too slow to maintain the pace the party needed to make depot after depot before the weather closed in, walked out of the tent on March 16th into a blizzard that was howling around the small canvas shelter. He said the words that have become the most famous in the literature of polar exploration. He was never found. Scott, Wilson and Bowers continued. They reached a point approximately 11 miles south of One Ton Depot, the last major supply port on their route, and were stopped by a blizzard that pinned them in their tent for 9 days. The blizzard did not stop. They ran out of food. They wrote their letters and their diaries. Scott's final entry ends with words that have been read and reread for a century. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. They were 11 miles from the depot. Ernest Shackleton, who had turned back from the pole 3 years earlier, and who would lead the Endurance expedition 3 years later, represents a different archetype in the history of polar supply, where Scott's story is tragic, a careful man defeated by circumstances that were almost but not quite within his control. Shackleton's is something rarer, a story of improvisation so brilliant that it seems almost impossible in retrospect, of supply created from nothing in the most hostile environment on Earth. When the Endurance was crushed by pack ice in the Weddell Sea in November 1915 and sank, Shackleton's crew of 28 men found themselves on the ice with 3 small lifeboats, the equipment they had salvaged from the ship, and no means whatsoever of communicating with the outside world. The nearest land was hundreds of miles away. The nearest inhabited land was considerably further. There was no supply port. There was no supply chain. There was no infrastructure of any kind, only the ice and the boats and the men. Shackleton's response was to build a supply chain from the materials at hand. He organised seal hunting and penguin hunting to supplement the ships, stores that had been salvaged. He rationed with precision, tracking every pound of food with the same care that a ship's quartermaster would apply in normal conditions. He maintained morale through the months of waiting on the ice, months in which they drifted north and south with the movement of the pack, by imposing a routine, by keeping men occupied, by treating the situation not as a catastrophe, but as a problem to be solved. When the ice finally broke up and they launched the boats, he navigated to Elephant Island, a bleak, uninhabited outcropping at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, after 7 days in open boats through some of the most violent seas on Earth. It was the first land they had stood on in nearly 500 days. But Elephant Island had no food and no hope of rescue. It was not a supply port. It was a temporary ledge above the cold water. The solution was the James Caird, one of the lifeboats, modified as well as it could be in the circumstances, and an 800-mile voyage across the Drake Passage to South Georgia Island, where there were whaling stations. It took 17 days. Shackleton and his 5 companions arrived at the coast of South Georgia with the navigation, done by Frank Worsley with a sextant and a chronometer on a heaving open boat, in frequently overcast conditions, accurate to within a few miles. They then crossed the island on foot. No one had crossed South Georgia before, and the interior was unmapped mountains and glaciers, and arrived at the Stromness whaling station on May 20th, 1916. The whalers who met them at the gate initially did not recognise them. They were gaunt and black with blubber smoke, and their hair was long and their clothes were rags. But they were alive. And behind them, on the other side of the island and on Elephant Island, were 22 more men who were also alive, who had survived because Shackleton had never stopped calculating, never stopped managing the supply chain of their survival, never stopped treating the problem as something that could be solved rather than something that had to be endured. All 28 men of the Endurance expedition survived. Not one was lost. The contrast between Scott and Shackleton, 2 men who faced the same ocean in the same era with different preparations and different outcomes, is sometimes presented as a contrast of character, the cautious planner versus the charismatic improviser. But the more instructive contrast is one of supply philosophy. Scott's plan was careful and detailed and built on accurate calculations, and it failed because some of the key variables turned out to be different from what the calculations assumed. Shackleton's situation was so far beyond any pre-existing plan that no calculations applied, and so he responded to each day's reality, rather than to any prior expectation. He was not better at planning than Scott. He was better at abandoning plans when the plans no longer matched the world. This flexibility, the capacity to revise the supply calculation in real time as new information arrived, is, looking back across the whole of this history, one of the qualities that most consistently separated survival from disaster. Hanno turned back, not because his plan called for turning back at a particular point, but because the provisions told him the plan had to change. The Malindi pilot changed da Gama's entire approach to the Indian Ocean crossing, and da Gama recognised the value of that change and took it. Shackleton burned the James Caird's fuel in the most efficient possible way because the fuel was finite and the distance was fixed, and there was no margin for calculation errors. The people who died, Hudson's men, Burke, Scott's party, were in part the victims of plans that had become disconnected from the reality they were meant to address, and of circumstances that moved too fast for the plan to catch up. The last supply port is, in the end, a test of this quality. When you pass it, you commit to the reality of what you are carrying rather than the abstraction of what you plan to carry. The biscuits in the hold are the biscuits in the hold. The water in the cask is the water in the cask. The fuel in the can, as Scott discovered to his cost, is not necessarily the fuel that was planned to be in the can. The last port is where the plan meets the world, and from that point on, only the world has a vote. There is a thread that runs through all of these stories, from Hanno's fleet turning back along the guerrilla coast of West Africa, to Shackleton's battered lifeboat arriving at South Georgia, to the convoy system that kept Britain alive through the U-boat campaign, and it is this. The supply port is never simply a location. It is a calculation made visible in physical form. It is the point where the abstract arithmetic of survival becomes a physical reality. Water in the barrels, grain in the hold, coal in the bunkers, food in the depot. Fresh oranges in the hands of dying sailors. The supply port is where the mathematics of human endurance is either vindicated or refuted. The decision about whether to pass the last supply port and keep going is always, at its core, a decision about how much you trust your own calculations against the uncertainty of what lies ahead. Can I carry enough for the distance? Is my estimate of the distance accurate? What happens if I am wrong by 10% or 20 or 50? How much margin have I built into the calculation, and is that margin adequate for the failure modes I can anticipate, and for the failure modes I cannot? The people in these stories who survived, most of them, were not necessarily the most courageous, or the most skilled, or the most favoured by fortune. They were the ones who understood the arithmetic and who had, through experience or instinct or both, built in the right amount of margin. Hanno understood it and turned back in time. The VOC understood it so coldly that it built human mortality into its business model. Shackleton understood it with a clarity that bordered on the miraculous and converted it into the survival of 28 men in circumstances where survival seemed impossible. The people who did not come back, Hudson in his small boat on the bay, Burke dying under the Australian sun, Scott in his tent 11 miles short, failed in different ways at the same calculation. Not because they were foolish or careless. Scott was meticulous. Wills was a trained scientist. Hudson was an experienced navigator. They failed because the arithmetic was harder than it had appeared, because the variables they could not control combined against them in ways that no reasonable planning could have fully anticipated. The 9 hours that separated Burke from Bra's departure, the 10 degrees of extra coal that depleted Scott's fuel faster than his calculations allowed, the ice that held Hudson's ship a month, longer than his provisions could sustain. These margins, 9 hours, 10 degrees, a month of unexpected ice, are what makes the supply port story humanly interesting beyond its historical and military dimensions. The margins are so small, the outcomes on either side of them are so vastly different. Arrive at the depot in time and you live and eventually go home and write a memoir. Miss it by 9 hours, and you die under a coolaba tree in the Australian outback with a diary entry that no one will read for weeks. The modern world has not solved this problem. It has changed its vocabulary. The logistics of global supply chains, of international shipping, of the just-in-time manufacturing systems that supply factories and hospitals and grocery stores, are built on calculations of exactly the same kind that Hanno's supply officers performed in the harbour of Carthage. The satellites that maintain contact with spacecraft beyond the edge of the solar system are managing a supply problem on a scale that those ancient Carthaginians could not have imagined, but the mathematics are the same. You can only carry a finite amount of fuel and provisions, and the distance you can cover before they run out is the distance you can cover, and no amount of wanting to go further changes that boundary. What changes is the precision of the calculation and the reliability of the information that goes into it. Hanno's supply officers were working with rough estimates of distance, seasonal averages for wind and current, and the accumulated experience of earlier Carthaginian voyages that had not gone as far. Modern mission planners have computers and orbital mechanics, and the most precise measurements of distance and velocity in human history. But the underlying structure of the problem is unchanged. Resources are finite, and the world is large, and the question is always the same. Will you have enough? The sea around the islands on the night when you are sailing past the last. One is very wide and very dark. The sound of the water against the hull is the same sound that Hanno heard in the darkness beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that da Gama heard somewhere in the Mozambique Channel with his crew dying around him, that Scott heard, in its frozen variant, the creak of ice rather than the wash of water, from his tent on the barrier with 11 miles yet to go. It is the sound of the world beyond the supply network, the sound of the unknown miles, and the question it poses is the oldest question in the history of human movement. Do you have enough to reach what lies ahead? What these stories share, taken as a whole, is not merely the drama of survival or the tragedy of loss. They share a quality of attention to the material world, the weight of water in a cask, the calories remaining in a biscuit tin, the tons of coal in the bunker. that was, for the people living these stories, the most urgent and immediate form of knowledge available. We tend to remember the great navigators for their courage, and the great generals for their tactics, and the great explorers for their discoveries. But what made the difference, in the moments that mattered, was usually something less glamorous. The count. How many? How much? How far? How long? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is barely. And sometimes the answer is no, and the light of the last port has already faded behind you, and there is nothing ahead but the distance, and the wind, and the arithmetic. The history of human civilization is, in very large part, the history of learning to say yes more often. It is the history of the warehouses built at the Cape, the convoy routes protected across the Atlantic, the citrus loaded at Malindi, the depots stocked along the road to Moscow, all the accumulated knowledge of what is needed and how much, and where it must be when you arrive. It is also, if you look at it carefully, the history of the people who manage these systems. They are not the celebrated figures of the past. Their names do not appear on statues or in textbooks written for children. They were the prefects of the grain supply, and the company quartermasters and the harbour administrators and the depot sergeants, the people who counted the biscuits and checked the water casks and made sure the fuel had not evaporated from the cans. Their work was invisible when it succeeded, which was most of the time, and catastrophic when it failed, which happened often enough to fill the histories that do get written down. There is something worth sitting with, in the quiet before sleep, in the thought of these invisible people doing their necessary work. The prefect of the Annona in Rome in 22 BC, trying to explain to the crowd why the grain ships were late and what was being done about it. The Cape Colony administrator in the early 1700s, checking the vegetable gardens and the cattle pens and the water supplies and sending a report to the Heeren, 17 in Amsterdam. The British convoy escort commander in April 1917, watching the depth charges go down and waiting for the oil slick that would tell him the submarine had been destroyed and the merchant ships behind him were safe for a few more miles. These people understood the supply port in the way that only the people closest to the problem ever do, not as a concept or a metaphor or a historical narrative, but as a thing that either works or doesn't, a thing with weight and dimensions and a daily requirement for human attention. The last supply port in their hands was never the romantic threshold of an adventure story. It was a checklist. It was a quantity of water and food and fuel that had to be exactly right before the next departure, because if it wasn't right, people would die. The fact that we can now tell these stories, the fact that Hanno's account survived in Greek translation, that da Gama's pilots kept journals, that Scott wrote in his diary almost to the last hour is itself a product of the supply system. The stories exist because enough ships came home, enough expeditions made it back, enough soldiers survived to tell what happened. The losses are real, and they matter, and they deserve to be named. But they are the exceptions. The rule, the daily, unromantic, uncelebrated rule, is that the barrels got filled, the cans got checked, the pilots were found, and the ships came home. Most of the time, it is enough. The ships come home, the expeditions return, the supply lines hold. And on the nights when they do not, those small, cold, final moments at the edge of the achievable, there is this, that the people who did not make it back knew they were reaching for something real, something worth the risk, the coast beyond the last port, the answer to the question that the sea has always asked. They went, and they found it, or they found the edge of it, and either way the world became a little larger for their going. That is what happens when you miss the last supply port, and that is what happens when you find it just in time.